and welcome to another edition of the Purple Theory Podcast, a very special edition of the Purple Theory Podcast, should I say, because it is NFL draft season, and we have on with us tonight none other than one of the internet's most preeminent draft gurus, Benjamin Robinson, he of Grinding the Mocks fame, among other internet fame. Benjamin, how are you this evening?
Doing well. Yeah, I wouldn't call myself a guru because I don't watch that much tape, which is kind of why I named the site Grinding the Mocks, because I don't know what I'm looking at and I just enjoy watching football when it happens. So this is kind of my way of getting out of watching really crappy YouTube highlight cut-ups on players so that I can kind of get a sense of where they're going to go in the draft.
Well, I was informed by Sage Rosenfeld the other day that in fact only 1,000 people on Earth know how to watch.
It's not even worth it for me. Not even worth it. I can never.
Why even try?
Why even try? Yeah, exactly.
Also spoken like a true guru, saying that you're not a guru. That's it's very on brand. So Benjamin, for our listeners who are TCU and Big 12 specific, tell us about who you are, who your site is, and kind of the whole story of how you got from guy who's interested in mock drafts to having maybe the best resource online for figuring out kind of what the consensus projections for these drafts are.
Sure. So, kind of started on my college friend's couch in Pittsburgh, where I went to college. Go Panthers.
Shout out to Brennan Marion, friend of the program.
Yeah, no, very excited. Would love for him to be our eventual offensive coordinator. But that's besides the point. But yes, so sitting on my friend's couch in 2018 draft, and we're watching NFL Network because we don't want to watch the ESPN broadcast. We're just kind of listening, and I have an econ degree. My buddy's a political science guy, so we're kind of social sciencey, economics guys. We're kind of sitting there, and you hear a pick come by, and sometimes you kind of know that hey, this is where a player might go, and you can really tell when like a real reach is, or when you get somebody who's fallen really far, depending on kind of just overall buzz. But we kind of wanted to look deeper. And so we were talking and we said to each other, how do you know when a player's supposed to go? I don't know. I mean, there's tons of different ideas, mock drafts all over the place, but how do you really quantify like what a reach is or what a steal is in draft? And so we're kind of talking and we said, mock drafts are basically data. Like what if I compiled that and kind of analyzed it as a data set? And so that's kind of where it started. That journey started was just kind of, and that's the great thing about the draft is it brings together fans of many different teams. Like I'm a Bengals fan. I'm from Cincinnati originally, and my buddy's a Steelers fan, but we can kind of commiserate and have fun when it comes to the draft. So kind of went down that rabbit hole, and it's taken me to where it is today, where 4 years later, this is my kind of third or fourth draft that I've been doing this project on, where we have a really strong track record of being able to predict where players go in the draft.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it's cool because, I mean, it's a one-sided matching problem to get nerdy and econ right there. But there are so many wheels about, fit and relative value and kind of, does a team have a 5-year plan or they're trying to execute, and where does, the player they're trying to take go, or teams just doing best available? Like there's all these kind of underlying and unmeasured strategy things that we'll never really know. And so that's super interesting to see like how people forecast and whether aggregate data can kind of give us a better idea. So yeah, here's your opportunity. Brag, flex, how accurate have you been kind of aggregating? Well, before we do that, what does your site do? If someone knows what the internet is and knows what a mock draft is, but doesn't know very much beyond that, what does your site do?
Sure. So, basically the idea is every single mock draft that I have in kind of the collection that I've put together, that I've scraped from the internet, what we do is we basically look at their players kind of change over time and just kind of it's like a very simple kind of model. So basically what we do is we look at change over time in the mock drafts and kind of model it as a kind of changing. It's really a very simple process. The idea is that over time in the draft process, we learn more about the players. We learn more about how their relative value looks in mock drafts. And so we can kind of just over time see the trend in where people are projecting these players to go. And the general idea is that, and it kind of comes from like my background in economics, which is that And I studied a lot of kind of urban and real estate economics, housing issues, and we often put a kind of a lot of stock into prices. And so in this case, a draft pick is basically a price. You're saying, hey, at this price, at this place in the draft, this is kind of where I see it. And there's all these things that are kind of embedded. So some of those things that you talked about, some of those hidden things are technically kind of embedded inside of the mock draft selection. By saying that Treyvon Merrick is going at pick 25, you're saying that you think that he is one of the best players in the draft at a position of importance that teams might want to take a look at. You're saying he's athletic. You're saying he's productive. You're saying that he's liked in these ways, and that people view him in this way. So it's like kind of my sly way of saying that it's a kind of a market-based view of the data. And it also comes from this idea in social science that, you know, one expert isn't necessarily better than another expert at consistently being accurate. There's a guy named Philip Tetlock at the University of Pennsylvania who studied this and written quite a lot about forecasting and about kind of these things that he calls super forecasters, people who are kind of really good at forecasting and what makes them good at it. But for the most part, what he's learned is that experts it's really hard to be consistent year to year to year. And so you'll be better off looking at a kind of basket of the forecasts than at the forecast itself. And this is something that's been studied quite a lot. So it's got like a pretty strong evidence base. And so, you know, just decided to kind of apply that to the draft. And I'm not the first person to do this ever. I thought I was for a long time, but Brian Burke, AKA like the godfather of football analytics, did something kind of similar. And he still does for now that he works for ESPN. They have a metric called ESPN Draft Predictor, but I think that overall my work is a little bit stronger than his, at least in the 1 year sample of publicly released data that they've shared.
Interesting. Yeah. I think I've seen Burke do like the probability that someone's left on the board or something. So it's kind of like what you're doing from the other purview. Saying that about real estate prices is fascinating because I hadn't thought about this, but like it's exactly like a house. Like there's certain characteristics of a house that are attractive to certain buyers, and those are going to vary based on taste, preference, strategy, whatever. And so kind of seeing what price do they land on. That's a really interesting way to do that. To think of this. Okay, so now I want to come back to basically what you're doing is saying I have an available world of mock drafts from reputable sources. Are you limiting where you filter those in? Or are you just saying anyone I can get data on, I'm going to bring that in, and that's of good repute, I'm going to bring that in? Or do you have kind of a panel that you have limited the mock drafts to?
So what I come from in this sort of world is like a little bit of I'm going to let the data tell me what is and what isn't. So we have an assumption that, you know, people who are kind of professional draft analysts are better at this than others, but I don't know that. And so to me, what I do in my data set is I rate the different people making mock drafts based on historic accuracy and the data that I have, and I upweight and downweight the different mock drafts based on that. And so you'll get like a Daniel Jeremiah from NFL Network, and we'll rate him higher than, you know, average Joe Schmo who writes for a website and publishes a mock draft. But at the same time, I want to have kind of a vast array of outcomes to choose from when we look at the data. And so sometimes it helps to have data, even if it's from a source that you wouldn't think of as reputable. But in some cases, my main point is just to be humble. You know, we don't know who's better at this, but so you end up with what you might call like quite a bit of like groupthink. And so there are a lot of times where people who make mock drafts, even the really good ones, don't think about kind of team tendencies. So some teams tend to take players earlier or later than expected. And then they also oftentimes don't think about kind of historical norms when it comes to how the draft runs. Like in the first round, like having more than 4 quarterbacks is really rare. So this year there's potential for 5. But every now and then you see a mock draft with 6 and you just kind of shrug your head that said, well, 4 is already really high. We're already pushing the historical norms. Is this draft class that different? And so that helps too. So there's a crowd, they're influenced by thought leaders. They may not always 100% get the kind of tendencies right. But at the same time, the goal shouldn't be, it depends what your objective function is. So my objective function is to have the lowest like mean squared error as I possibly can. So I'm not trying to get as many picks right. I want to be in and around the area as much as possible, and I don't want to miss on earlier picks. I'd rather miss on later picks than earlier picks. So that's my objective function. But oftentimes we don't ask what the mock draft person's objective function is, which probably is like, it can be to start a conversation. It can be to, copy someone else. It can really varies. But for me, when you're doing this sort of statistics and stuff, it's important to know what your objective function is. And for me, like I said, it's to minimize the error as much as I can, especially focusing on getting the top picks right.
Because for a minimized error, for people at home, that's going to end up being more like, I'm on average better at predicting who's generally available at a given pick, not necessarily the realization of which team was taken. So like after the first, there's more or less certainty in the first couple picks, and getting those right is really important. But after that, it's more, am I confident that this person's going to be available at this pick? And that's really where you get value, I think, in some of these kind of aggregate models there. So, okay, we've built that back up. I'm coming back to this question now. Flex, show off, don't be humble. How good is your model?
So it varies year by year. So basically I have a model for each year. So we'll talk about last year. So last year, it's kind of an uncertain draft. We had the pandemic. Teams were doing the draft virtually. And there wasn't a pro day circuit really. So you didn't get as much information coming out of the pro days. And so in terms of my methodology, when I look at my data, when I look at my objective function, I was in the 95th percentile of first round mocks last year, just using the rankings. So no massaging of the data, no, I'm going to write a mock draft, even though I do that. So yeah, the data is like pretty strong that this sort of thing, I can be as, like I said, I don't watch the prospects. I follow along on Twitter, but it doesn't influence any of my data work. Just using the data, I can be up there in accuracy by my numbers in the area of some of the best draft analysts in the industry. Like I said, I watch football for enjoyment. I don't watch football to dissect prospects. I watch football because I enjoy it. And so, so I mean, that's like I'm humble about it. Like the data is, I'm not doing this. This is information that comes from people who watch the tape, theoretically, right? So I'm not necessarily saying like, hey, like I do this all alone. Like I do this, I carry everybody with me a little bit by little bit, even if they're a small part of the data set, they contributed to the overall output of it. And it's just me collating that and presenting it.
Yeah. Well, and I think, stuff like if you're pulling in something from, like Broncos fan 47, who's like, oh yeah, Trevor Lawrence is actually going to fall to number 10 and we're going to get him. The leverage on that has to be so small just because it's such a huge outlier from what everybody else is saying. So it probably comes out in the wash. I had a couple of thoughts there and I wrote them down because I'm a crazy person. One, the draft last year was like, in retrospect, charming. Now we have to put a huge asterisk on that because
People died.
There was a pandemic and we thought the world was ending and there was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of high stress, a lot of sleepless nights. But that was one of the first times in the pandemic where I felt like on Twitter and then in my real life friends, we were doing something together. I FaceTimed probably 6 different friends during the first round of the draft. I never watched the NFL draft live. I'm always like, well, I'll just see it later. Watch it live, FaceTime's friends, and sheer genuine enjoyment about something. So I'm very excited to kind of replicate that again this year, seeing how fun it was last year. And in terms of watching film, I just want to shout out someone. I saw this on my feed today. Like Brandon Thorne is a guy. Some of these guys who are just like literally grinding film are like, hey, here's my, here's a 3-hour film breakdown on my 48th ranked tackle. And I'm like, dude, I could name you 12 tackles maybe that are in this thing. That's just incredible. Okay.
Dedication.
Yeah, seriously. Okay. I have one more big picture question. We're going to get in the nitty gritty. We're going to start talking about TCU and some Big 12 prospects in kind of the first round. There was not a combine this year. Do you think that affects the perception of college athletes from different levels of schools? And so I'm going to put some bones on that. But do you think that not having a combine is going to make evaluations trend more towards bigger teams that can put on pro days and kind of have more professional experiences there? Or do you think it's really on average not going to matter that there wasn't a combine where, these potential undiscovered athletes could come and get these really big numbers in front of people?
Yeah, I think it's a tough question. For me, when we looked at what happened last year we had a record low number of players from outside of like Division One that were drafted. And then in terms of the unsigned, like the undrafted free agent class and the NFL football research people or whatever, Mike Lopez's shop had this chart last year. It was a deviation from the historical norms where I think the pro days mainly serve as a way to get guys who are kind of interesting, but they don't have data on them. So, for example, most of the major programs have junior days every year. And so teams send their area scouts to those junior days. So they have data on players, not just the combine data. So I think for a guy like, for like your TCU guys, like our Darius Washington and Treyvon Merrick, like they probably are unaffected by the lack of a combine. But, players from, schools like North Texas may be more likely to be affected because they're not getting a lot of attention before anyway, except maybe if you're like Jalen Darden or whatever. But, for the most part, it's going to be hard for you to get seen. And that's just the most important thing. So I think that for the most part, most prospects, and this draft is kind of interesting because there's the lowest number of people who have signed with agents in a long time. Like there's only been there was an article from, I think, the ex-Deadspin people. And they said that basically according to the NFLPA, like the number of players who have signed with agents this year is just so small, people taking advantage of the extra year to return to school. So there's a smaller class this year, but we have less data on them. And in some ways we have censored data on them too, because, you don't have a full, out of conference schedule. So this year, some of the evaluations are hard. Next year's draft will be kind of more of a bumper crop because you'll have players who took on that extra year of eligibility come back and be a part of this next year's class. So I expect there'd be kind of a deviation next year, but this year I think you'll see a trend similar to what happened last year where, fewer players in the smaller rung schools make it as undrafted free agents, and a lot of them are definitely not going to get drafted outside of some of the players that you see like Quinn Miners from Wisconsin Whitewater, who's kind of the darling of the D2. Like that's a rarity because he went to the Senior Bowl, but the Senior Bowl doesn't take many of those guys.
Yeah. You do not have to comment on this. I just want to say this out loud. It would not surprise me if the Senior Bowl is a paid advertising firm that agents and students are paying to get pumped up for their draft stock and have all this advertising. You don't have to comment on that. That's just, it wouldn't surprise me. Let's talk about some TCU prospects and let's talk about the first round. So I'm pulling up right now on your website, Grinding the Mocks. You go to the landing page, you can go to Prospect Trends, and you get this cool tool where you can select individuals and kind of see over time from, last summer, basically, which probably is when they start drafting until now, what kind of happens. And so I pulled up 3 guys on the same graph, which is just an incredible tool. And I can't imagine how annoying this was to make in Shiny in R. So kudos to you for this, how good this looks. But so the first person I have Treyvon Merrick, who is TCU's strong safety, the top safety in the draft, almost by consensus. He and Washington came into the season the highest graded safeties by Pro Football Focus. There was a lot of expectations, and he actually rose. So he was kind of, round 2 guy last summer, middle of the season was verging on round 1 and is now solidly in that 16 to 32 range here on your graph. So 16 to 32 being kind of the second half of the first round. So what influences a player to rise like that? And where do you see Merrick going to what team?
So, I think what influences a player to rise in the draft is they have a spectacular season. And so they separate themselves, they distinguish themselves. So you're right. I think that I haven't looked at Arif Hassan's, who writes for The Athletic. He has this consensus big board. It wouldn't surprise me if Treyvon Merrick was the consensus number one safety on that as well. So I think it helps that he's kind of distinguished himself, but also the relative strength of the safety class this year is kind of smaller. So yeah, I mean, I think that, like I said, I didn't watch a lot of him. I barely kind of watched the few teams that I root for. But basically, when you see someone rise like that, it means that they distinguish themselves and are viewed as a player that's elite at their position. So teams, mock drafters will kind of try to find ways to mock players to teams potentially that have needs for safety. So, teams like the Dallas Cowboys, stuff like that. But to me, I wouldn't necessarily say I'm very much good for saying which team he might go to. I would say Jacksonville, I think at 25 is a good spot for him, just because they have so many draft picks. They value speed and athleticism. Urban Meyer is good as the coach there now, and they have, personnel who used to work for the 49ers, who drafted kind of guys like Jimmy Ward in the first round, who came out of Northern Illinois when like Harbaugh was still coaching at the 49ers. So, to me, I think Merrick, I'd say like in my mock draft, I think will be coming out later this month. I think Jacksonville is a good spot. I also think a sneaky good spot is Tampa Bay. They play a lot of the multiple three safety defense, where you kind of use one of your safeties as an extra in the box linebacker, but they're also kind of like a bigger slot corner, so you can kind of match up guy. And so I think Merrick could fall in that way. But I still think he's really very likely to be a first round pick, and any team would be lucky to have his services as the top player at his position in the draft.
Yeah, and that's, the TCU plays that 4-2-5, and Merrick did not play that kind of, I don't know what we call it today, Jack Star, Cowboy, whatever. Everybody has a different name for it, but that super athletic guy who just does a lot of things, he didn't play that position because he was more suited to kind of the strong safety. But in the NFL, I think he would definitely fit in there quite well. So he seems to be another TCU first round draft pick, which they had two last year. Jeff Gladney and Ross Blacklock both went. No, did
Jalen Reagor?
Jalen Reagor, Blacklock. Jalen Reagor's on our bad side because he spent his entire senior year being loudly mad at Max to pump up his draft stock. But yeah, so and Jalen Reagor, and so this will be the third in 2 years. The second defensive consecutive year that they've had a defensive secondary player. That kind of brings us to the next player who's kind of now on the fringe of even is he a top prospect or not? But our Darius Washington actually last summer was higher than Treyvon Merrick in a lot of these mock drafts. He does have the knock that he is a little bit smaller. And so as we get more into the season of scrutiny and kind of these measurables, that a guy who's smaller is gonna potentially suffer as he gets compared to some other players. Also, he had a bad season. So I don't know if you have data on this. I'm totally putting you on the spot. Do you have any sense of like who are the biggest risers and fallers in this class? A professional podcast host would have given you this question like 2 days ago. So I want to apologize to the audience on my behalf. I'm putting Ben on the spot here, and it's totally fine if you say no. Not a big deal.
I mean, the biggest risers are probably the quarterbacks, Mac Jones and Zach Wilson. They're up there. There are players that kind of come into the collective conscience at certain points in the draft season. I think like Greg Newsome from Northwestern. But yeah, there's a lot of kind of players who start the process in the first round and drop. And so, there's always this kind of changing of the guard a little bit throughout the year as we kind of see players and then hear about players, and then thought leaders talk about players in the draft season after the season is over. But yeah, I mean, you can't talk about this draft without talking about Zach Wilson and Mac Jones, who, I knew Mac Jones was like a pretty good quarterback. I'm a Michigan fan, and I watched him torch Michigan in the bowl game they had. They still have amazing receivers, but he was still throwing the ball really well. So I knew he was pretty good. Like, I thought he was a draftable prospect, but I don't think there was a lot of people who would have thought that Zach Wilson the year before would have the kind of season that he had. So quarterbacks get a lot of shine because they're the most important. But yeah, it can happen. Yeah, so the quarterbacks, like at the beginning of the year, the quarterbacks that people were saying were like part of the first round were, Justin Fields and Trevor Lawrence, same as it ever was. Trey Lance, same as it ever was. But you had, Jamie Newman, who had transferred to Georgia, and people were assuming that his transfer to Georgia would be a harbinger for a big year.
That feels like another lifetime. That feels like a parallel universe that I dreamt about, and that did not actually happen. The
Exactly.
Jamie Newman hype was out of control for a minute.
Yep. Yeah, hey, it makes sense. He had shown a lot of promise, and but he probably maybe more than a lot of different players was punished for not playing. It's really kind of interesting, and I don't necessarily have a good reason for this, but there are some players who are punished for opting out at the same time as other players who opted out are kind of not being punished in the data. It's very like selective enforcement wise. I noticed it a little bit with one of my Pitt alums, Jalen Twyman, who's a defensive tackle, played for Pitt, had really strong 2 years as a starter and then decided he didn't want to play, whether it's because he felt strong about his position or got advice or pandemic fears, like all rational and fine reasons to not play. But I see it a little bit, I saw it a little bit there, and then I kind of thought about it, and you see it quite a bit to me, most starkly at the offensive tackle position, with the debate between Penei Sewell, offensive tackle from Oregon, and Rashawn Slater, offensive tackle from Northwestern. Rashawn Slater's, a very, very, very good prospect, but no one was talking about, not enough to say nobody, but I think people have thought of Penei Sewell in a much better way. And I've not really heard a lot of people talk about how Rashawn Slater opted out from the Big Ten season this year, but I hear it all the time with Penei Sewell. And maybe it's because Slater had like one good game where he stopped Chase Young a little bit, and that's kind of been a good performance for him that has impacted people's perception of him quite a bit. But yeah, I've seen a little bit of uneven kind of treatment of players depending on, for whatever reason you want to look at it. But Jamie Newman is one of the ones that his stock has taken the biggest hit, in part because I think he didn't play.
Yeah,
so, and it sucks for him.
Yeah, well, and two, if I don't want to say this confidently because I may be misremembering this, but I think he cited like actual mental health issues. I think he had a close relative that he lost to COVID, and so man, you just
totally
hate
rational.
That, yeah, you would just love a little empathy there.
Yes.
And so that's interesting. That Darius Washington is someone who, in a year when a lot of people opted out and saw their stock, tread water or improve, Darius Washington played and he had a bad year, and it is absolutely reflected in these numbers and in your numbers. It looks like, he just kind of plummets steadily, and then you can see again just a little bit more kind of a downward trend as we get into the off season of February, March, April, where we're looking at measurables and everything. Do you think that there's a bias is a bad word because it sounds pejorative, but do you think that there's a bias towards offense in these mock drafts, especially as we get into the offseason and we start looking back and we're able to quantify offensive ability or understand offensive ability a little bit better?
I'd say that there's some bias in the quarterback position, but I wouldn't say that there's necessarily bias to either side of the ball more or less in mock drafts. I think this year specifically is a year where the receiver class and the quarterback class and the wide receiver class are viewed as strengths of the class. Whereas in the past, people have said like last year was a good, cornerback class, but it kind of varies depending on the talent. Also there's this shift in college where, we're putting guys that maybe were running backs in the past in the receiver position. So I think there's this, as the college game becomes way more pass heavy, you're seeing more players that might've been on the running back side kind of become smaller receivers. So to me, I don't think that there's a huge biased offense defense, but we do see bias in the data around quarterbacks, where quarterbacks are often overrated. You see this quite a bit with guys that have been super productive. My biggest one was kind of Drew Lock in 2019. He was a consensus first round pick and he was a second rounder. And then, saw a guy like Will Greer as well in that year from West Virginia, who, had a really, really awesome college career. and he was kind of propped up and ended up going probably like maybe a round later than people thought he would. And so people tend to prop up quarterbacks this year. The players that are getting propped up, I think potentially it could be Mac Jones is an example of that. He might be getting propped up higher than where he'll go. That's like one of the most uncertain parts of the draft. But then you see guys like Davis Mills from Stanford and Kellen Mond from Texas A&M getting propped up in certain ways. Maybe they'll go in the second round or the third round, but yeah, who knows? I'm still waiting for the other shoe to drop because, it happens quite often where players are kind of quarterbacks specifically are kind of magicked up higher than they actually end up going.
Yeah. I just have a million questions and I'm trying to write them down so that I don't go all over the place. Okay, so I want to talk very quickly about the last TCU player, because again, only defensive players for TCU are kind of on the board right now. Garrett Wallow is another linebacker, and he started in the 180s, had himself a really good season, and then in the middle of February just had a huge drop off. And then a little spike as of recent, and he's back up to potentially maybe third round, fourth round, probably closer to fourth round there doing the math. What do you think is a reason for a prospect to spike so dramatically in the off season, or spike downward? What's the plummet so dramatically in the off season?
It's usually a small sample at first, and then as you get more mock drafts, you can kind of be more, you kind of get a better sense of where they're going to go. So to me, like, you might have seen him, like people were like, oh, like he's a good player, like I'm going to put him in mock draft. So yeah, I think that's mostly what it has to do with. And so, for a player like him, he's outside my top 150 players. I think he could get drafted. But if it is, it'll be kind of probably in the later part of the last day of the draft. But yeah, I think a lot of it is small sample size issues. And so as you watch throughout the year, people will say, and I've seen this quite often because I look at my data before I publish it every week, you'll see a player pop up in the first round or something like that. And it's always because, we're looking at extrapolating from a small sample trend, basically. So, for me, yeah, like it wouldn't surprise me if sometimes you get players where they kind of pop up really early and then they kind of go back down to like naturally where the data expects them to go.
Interesting. And so obviously there's a lot more variance the further you go, because these are all in the draft, because these are all dependent on each other, these picks. So do you find that you're, losing a lot of ground in the later rounds? Or how many of these do you, these like 6th and 7th round picks that could be undrafted or undrafted free agents? Are you like losing a lot of value there in terms of your mean squared error, or do you do pretty well across the 6 rounds or 7 rounds?
Oh, it's bad later on. I mean, so yeah, I mean, what you end up with is doing really well in the first round, fine-ish in the second round, but it decays each day of the draft just because there's a lot of incomplete information in a mock draft. So most mock drafts are only first round, so you only get 32 picks. So what you end up with is a lot of players in the first round conversation will have, a lot of mock drafts. Players on the lower end have smaller ones. And so I do my best to try to collect as many multi-round mock drafts as possible to get as much of a sample, but sometimes those come from the same kind of operators. And so they don't really necessarily change their mock draft all that much because they're just like, it's really hard to make an original 250 plus mock draft every single time. So for those that do, I take my hats off to them. But yeah, so you end up with players who kind of end up being mocked a lot, probably sometimes in the same position. So, but yeah, I think you end up with basically a much less diverse and much less representative panel at that point of the people that do that. Most people are just doing the first round, maybe the second. And so I do my best every year to try to collect a larger proportion of mock drafts in my sample that are multi-round, but it's hard just because there's not a lot out there.
Yeah. And I mean, at some point you're just taking lottery tickets, in the last couple rounds.
Yeah. And so to me, like I said in the beginning as well, my focus isn't being accurate on every pick. It's being within a certain range. And that range increases as the draft goes on, basically. So, and my goal is not necessarily to be right about the later picks, is to be more right about the early picks. And that's why I want to be better there because those are the most valuable players in the draft.
Yeah. Do you, okay, we're going to get in the crazy ideas portion of this podcast if I don't restrain myself. So I'm gonna ask this question, then we'll come back to the quarterback question. Do you think there's an opportunity for like an unexploited opportunity for arbitrage in the late rounds? Like if you were really dialed in on your value and you're really dialed in on, I'm pretty sure these guys are going to be available at any given pick. Why do teams not, trade around and shuffle and try and get a little extra value in the late rounds more than they do?
So number one is that the teams have much more information than the public does. So there's some things where and the way that teams set their draft boards is very different. So, there are 250 some picks in the draft, but teams will have 100 or some players on their board. So there's some players who I think is a value, but some teams may not even have them on their board. So, for example, last year there was a guy from Auburn, offensive tackle named Prince Tega Winogo, who people thought he was a very good college player, and it came out in the process that he had really bad knees, basically. And so it wouldn't surprise me that a lot of teams are just like, well, we're not drafting him. Well, who cares that he's my, 100 whatever ranked player? Like, that's not going to fly for a lot of teams. So in the practical sense, not every player is on every team's board. And that makes sense because it's a lot easier to select a player out of 150 than it is to select a player out of the whole universe of players in the draft, which could be from year to year, could be in the thousands of players. So the teams kind of simplify and some using data and using scouting in both, right? To kind of get the board down to, hey, these are the players who we think we want to take that are our players, for good or for bad. There's also not necessarily, like trades are not frictionless. It's not like a mock draft simulator where I can just like, oh, I'm getting all these offers. Like the trade market might be less liquid than we think, probably. And there's also a sense of it's not a single round game. It's not like, hey, you and I are playing a game right now. And, if I fleece you in this trade, for example, like who else is going to want to trade with me? Or maybe you'll never want to trade with me again. So it's a repeating game, basically, these trades. And so there's also people are friends with each other. It's a small world and they want to get jobs. So there's sometimes like a lot of different pieces at play to why teams don't do that a lot. But teams who do mostly use trading down in the draft to kind of as an insurance policy. So like, for example, the Minnesota Vikings, Rick Spielman, their general manager last year, had a ton of draft picks where they traded down a bunch of different times, but it was very smart. And they basically used the end of their draft. They had a ton of picks in like the 6th and 7th round to draft players that they basically wanted to make sure that they got as, instead of having to wait to see who they would sign with as undrafted free agents. So at that point, you're just taking, like you said, like kind of lottery picks, like I'm going to buy it, get a card. But there's also the sense of some teams that are kind of very stuck in their ways and they're like, I'm here, I'm going to pick here. So there's a lot of different factors at play. I think mostly it is that not every player is on every board and trades are not as easy to do as people think.
Yeah. Interesting. That's when you were talking about injuries. That's somebody like I had circled like Caleb Farley for Virginia Tech. I see a lot of people have him really, really high at cornerback, but he had, crazy big back surgery kind of a deal. And that could be something where there's divergent, public draft boards say he's good and he's healthy now, and public might or private data might have a little bit of different there. Okay. We have beat around the bush for far too long. It's time. I need you to settle the quarterback question. Is Mac Jones really going to go at 3?
I've been tracking this a little bit just because the quarterbacks are very attention getting. And I think there's quite a bit of cognitive dissonance. People are like very much of the sharp mind are like, yeah, this is happening. But everyone else is kind of like, I don't believe you, basically. So there's a problem there where the reporters and people with inside information are saying, hey, this is what's happening in my mock draft, but there's still quite a bit of divergent thought. And so right now, Justin Fields is my my third quarterback in the data, and Mac Jones is the 5th. So, and the reason behind that is that when people are thinking, when is Mac Jones going to go? It's kind of like, well, he can go at 3, but after pick 3, it really could be a lot of different spots. And so that's why if he's not going to go at 3, the question is, when is he going to go? And that's a hard question. And so he's fallen now to be, I think maybe even outside the top 10 in my data. So, and I think that's, or at least he's on the way to that, if he's not there already. And I think that's the reason, is that people have been so dialed into him being with the 49ers, even mocking him quite a lot at pick 12 when the 49ers still had pick 12. So, I think right now Justin Fields is that third quarterback in the data for me, but we'll see. I mean, it's time to put up or shut up. The mock drafts that are going to be published in the next week are my mock drafts that get weighted the highest. So, in the past, I've been wrong when there's also like late breaking information. So like 2018 Baker Mayfield, where, he was projected to be the third overall pick, but then kind of later in the day on draft day, it started leaking that the Browns wanted to take him first overall. So I missed on that one, and I'll be okay to miss out if that's what happens. But yeah, I think there's a lot of uncertainty with Mac Jones, and Justin Fields, I think less so, because the idea is that if he doesn't go at 3, well, he could go at number 4, and there's a decent chance he stays still in the top 10. But for Mac Jones, it's like, is he going to be at pick 3, or is he going to be at pick 20? Like, who knows? It's quite uncertain.
Yeah. And so I pull up his little draft stock chart, and I think it's really funny because there is a bubble kind of at the, at the end of March into April. You can look, he's like a Dutch tulip or something, that he peaks really high. It is interesting to look at the distribution between expert and fan, just because on this graph, they, fan is orange and expert is blue. And you can kind of see that maybe there were some more fan mock drafts that were driving Mac Jones being higher than some experts. But on the whole, it looks like that information kind of averages out, which is really, really nice. Okay, I have two more things that I want to get to. And I'm going to do the TCU specific one first. On this podcast, we have one running segment, and that segment is say nice things about Max Duggan, TCU's quarterback, and we put everyone on the spot with it. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of space to say nice things about Max Duggan.
Max is a quarterback, and yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about Max Duggan. He seems like, I don't know him personally, so I have no comment. Hopefully he has a good year this coming year, but hopefully my guy Kenny Pickett at Pitt has a better year. But I wish the best for both of them. Is that okay?
That's wonderful. I did a little kind of dumb toy model about quarterback improvement a couple weeks ago, and I kind of got basically a range of outcomes for Max Duggan based on returning production and experience and everything. And Kenny Pickett was his 2019 Kenny Pickett was his floor. So
oh no,
they could be kindred. The best response to that segment was Pro Football Focus's Anthony Treesh came on. And I didn't know Anthony as well as I do now then. And I said, say nice things about Max Duggan. And his response was, and we just had awkward silence on the podcast for a minute. Okay, my last question is one that's probably going to be way too nerdy for anyone except you and I to talk about, so I'm okay with that. But these mock drafts, they're happening throughout the week, right? So some people are releasing them on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, whatever, and you're scraping them on Saturday night or whatever and posting them at a regular time and kind of aggregating over. Have you looked at any like temporal variation to see if, a big board says X, so other mock drafts change their mind and agree with him, or they change their mind and disagree with him? Is there any kind of like lag and lead in, you have in this sample, you have, 1,200 something mock drafts. Surely if something's published on Monday, someone's going to see it for the mock draft they put on Friday. Do you account for that? Do you see any of that? Have you played around with that?
So I think there is some mock drafts are definitely a lagging indicator for the most part. And I think partially there's like a follow the leader mentality around, players that get mocked from kind of the creme de la creme of your draft analysts. So people pay attention to what they have to say, and they've also been historically accurate, so they're worth paying attention to. But yeah, I mean, most mock drafts are published on Monday. There's like a whole mock draft Monday hashtag. And so a lot of mock drafts get published Monday. And so I always try to publish data on Sunday so that you have data from kind of the whole week. But there's an argument to be said I should publish them on Monday. But yeah, it's a lagging indicator unless it's something kind of But they tend to react pretty quickly to big events. So, when the 49ers traded up into the number 3 pick, you saw very quickly the next day or two, a lot of movement from not as much from Mac Jones at that point, but from Trey Lance. And then Justin Fields is kind of already up there, so there's not as much movement for him to have. But you saw Trey Lance, a lot of movement. You saw some Mac Jones movement. But for other things, it can be slower to react to, like injuries to a player or decline in a player. There's some things that, if they're a high profile player, you might notice more, but if they're not, you just don't see it. But yeah, it varies. I did a blog post once about Tua Tagovailoa's injury last year. And what happened was that right after he got injured, there was suddenly people just had no clue about whether he was going to be in the draft. So he dropped out of some first round mocks. People didn't know as much if, he was going to be healthy. And then, eventually it got back on track and he was back in the, top 10. So there's a reaction that's lagged, but then it kind of eventually, ideally, if it happens enough time before the draft, it can kind of correct itself. But yeah, I mean, it is ultimately a lagging indicator. It's usually not a leading indicator. And I think that's fine because, I mean, when you view this as kind of, we're hoping to get towards equilibrium, basically. And so a lot of this information, the league might already know that player X is really good, but we didn't see it because we're not expert football people. And so this data can kind of be, in some ways, a measure of sentiment, and but ultimately, hopefully, with an eye on predictive power.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. So the NFL draft is coming up. It is next week, starting on Thursday, correct? And going to be going strong the whole weekend. I imagine you will have content out and about. Where can the people find you online? What can they expect over the next week leading up to the draft?
So grindingthemocks.com is the website. So normally I update the data on a weekly basis, but on the week of the draft, I'll be updating every day. And during the draft, I'll probably just kind of be watching and occasionally posting charts, updated charts of players where they get drafted relative to expectation. And the first night of the draft, I'll be on a live stream hosted by Football Outsiders, who I occasionally have written stuff for, and you as well. So the mothership of sorts for us. So I'll be on a live stream on the first night of the draft, starting at like 11:30. So I'm going to need like some strong coffee because I've been kind of working all day to collect as much of the last coming in mock drafts as possible. My Twitter account is at BENJ_Robinson. And that's where you can find a lot of the charts and stuff that I'll publish focused on the data.
Awesome. When the draft is done and all the picks have settled, what is the first thing you're going to do as you kind of go into the off season?
So I usually take a break a little bit. So I kind of walk away from it to kind of let things settle. There's some post-draft analysis that I do, but usually when the draft is over, I take some time off of work so I can kind of recharge. I don't usually start collecting data again until the summer at that point. So I usually take like a month or two off. We'll see how long I do that this year. But I usually take some time away to kind of recharge and let it sit, let it stew. And then I use the summer as opportunity to do kind of research and development and special projects. And then I'm probably not going to be publishing data again until, January of that year. So it kind of gives me opportunity to work on the product and everything. So there's no rush to really have to keep it a year-long thing or whatnot. Yeah. So I usually take a big, deep sigh of relief, hope that I was more right than I was wrong, and move on.
Awesome. Well, Ben, this was super fun and super insightful, and just kind of a good look into the draft and how to think about the draft. Again, you can find Ben's work, grindingthemocks.com is the website and the app and the tool, and follow him on Twitter. As always, I'm Stats War on Twitter, and thanks for listening today.